right, so today we're talking about Jacob heading back home again after his trip out to Paddan Aram to be with his uncle Laban. And how many years? Anybody know offhand? How many years did he actually spend in Paddan Aram?
14.
14? 20.
I just read it this morning.
It's part of what you're supposed to read, so all of you should have known that, except for the one that who guests here. Because they didn't get the assignment last week, so. But yeah, how did he increase his flocks? Anybody remember? How did his flocks get increased while he was there with Laban? How did he get flocks in the beginning, in the first place? How did he get sheep to begin with?
He was a sly old guy.
Yeah, so what did he do?
Deceived Esau.
What's that?
You got
Deceived
compared-
Esau. That was earlier for the birthright and the blessing, but now how did he deceive, or how did he get the flocks from Laban?
He swapped some black for white, or white for black.
Yeah.
One or the other.
Yeah, this whole thing about striped and spotted sheep to separate out and all of that, we're going to talk about that today. What is all that stuff about? What did Laban do? And why? When he found out he was all the sheep and
As
stuff.
soon as he made the agreement with Jacob, he got rid of all of them and took them way far away
Yeah,
from them.
yeah. He sent them away 3 days' journey to make sure that the flocks did not intermingle. And it's interesting because Laban sent his sons over with Jacob's flock, and he had Jacob take care of his own flock. So he knew the blessing was there with wherever Jacob was. And so he kept Jacob with his own flock. But turns out that didn't work out too well for him. What is Mizpah? Any of you went way back when you were dating and your sweetheart and you gave each other Mizpah stones or Mizpah necklace or anything like that? Nobody ever had one of those? Well, Frankie and I did. Little hits.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I'm interrupting.
It's a
your
watch.
story.
No. It means to watch over, right? To watch over. And we're going to go over that because that is a very significant phrase, not only in Genesis, but through the whole Bible. So we're going to end with that today. All right, now you may flip the page. Roland, you're not supposed to be looking ahead. No, because you're a rookie, I'll let you get away with it. But all right, page 48. Sheep and goats. Most people are not farmers anymore. So all these references to sheep and goats are kind of difficult for non-farmers. So a little bit of training on what sheep and goats are. I have been to the Middle East, in Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey, and Israel, and I've grown up on a farm, but I was not a sheep or a goat farmer, it should be. Yet I have seen many sheep and goats, and the truth is, it's hard to tell them apart. At least the ones I've seen. So our tour guide and locals just call them sheep goats. You see a flock, I don't know, Judy, when you were in the Middle East, did you see a flock or a herd of sheep goats? It's really hard to tell which are sheep and which are goats as this flock, this herd goes across them. They're not.
Interesting.
And they're usually not well fed, so they're not, in Australia you see these huge sheep that have these huge coats on them and stuff. Well, that's not the Middle East sheep goats. You can't really tell that much of a difference between them. In fact, look at I'll let you skip over to page 49. Look at the pictures there on 49. Tell me which one is a sheep and which one's a goat. Sheep goats. Okay. Sheep were generally the most delicate and usually with white coats. They love and stayed in the valley and plains and were or are never good in rocky crags or mountainous areas. They feed on grass more than leaves and shrubs and don't eat in the heat of the day. They tend to lay down and rest in the shade. They were used for wool, and the first fleece was given to the priests and Levites as a tithe. The tail of the sheep is unusual because it is similar to a camel hump, in that it is a collection of fatty tissue for storage of energy and not cartilage. Therefore was a prized possession in Bible times. Also, it was requested by God in sacrificing. Take from this ram the fat tail. Put these in the hands of Aaron and his sons as a burnt offering pleasing to the Lord. Exodus 29. Sheep were used for their wool. Wool was the primary clothing of the day. Okay? Rarely for food, and only on special occasion. The skin was not good, still is not good, for leather. So often they wore sheepskin that still had the wool on it, a fleece. Okay? So you don't see much sheep leather because the skin is just not good for leather. Right? And again, primary clothing of the day was wool, and it's itchy if you ever wear wool just on your skin, it's pretty itchy. If you were wealthy, then you would get into more of the linens and stuff like that, but man, wool was the primary for just about everybody. Goats. Goats were generally more sturdy and usually with black coats. They loved the slopes and the mountainside where they can find the leaves and the shrubs they like the most. Goats feed during the day, no matter the heat. The goats are much more headstrong and difficult to control and more likely to get in trouble. Goats were used for milk, for meat, and their coats made great leather. So goats are the opposite. Their coats made great leather. And I think the fact that sheep produce wool is the whole reason why their skins are not that prized, whereas the other animals don't produce that kind of thing on their skin. So. Feeding the flock was the most difficult part of shepherding, both sheep and goats. In the spring, the food was plentiful and abundant, and that's why harvesting usually occurred at the end of summer or the beginning of fall while the animals were at their fattest. The fall and winter were difficult times, and the shepherd had to lead their flock not only far away to find food, but away from competitor flocks. Separating the sheep from goats was a regular occurrence for feeding, since they preferred different vegetation. The flock moved toward the shepherd, and he would tap them with his rod on one side to go one way, and on the other side to go the other. So he would separate the sheep and the goats, just as Jesus mentioned in Matthew. That was a regular thing, and everybody knew separating. You would just tap it on the side of the head, and the sheep would go this way, tap the goat on that side, and they'd go that way, up on the mountainside to feed, and the sheep down in the valley to feed. Okay? So, now that you know that, hopefully this will make a little bit more sense to you as we go through the sheep and the goats as wages. Page 49, Genesis 30. Verse 25 to 43. If you have your Bibles, you can follow along, but I'm just giving you the summary here. Since we don't have time to read the whole passage, let me give you the summary. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, that's where we ended last time. So there are 11 sons now, right? Who's not born yet?
Benjamin.
Benjamin. He's not born yet. Jacob worked for Laban for more than 14 years and wanted to go his own way to build the wealth of his own family, instead of the wealth of Laban's family. Laban recognized that he was being blessed because Joseph, I keep getting Jacob and Joseph mixed up. That should be Jake, not Joseph. Because Jacob was working for him and told him to name his wages. After some negotiating, Jacob was to get the spotted and striped sheep and goats as his wages. Laban quickly agreed because they were pretty rare. You know you're on video right now too, Jared. Laban then separated the ones that are spotted and striped, and they are kept far away from the rest of the flock. 3 days' journey is what it was said. Then Jacob works on a plan to make more of the newborn sheep and goats spotted and striped, and on a way to make the strongest and the sturdiest in his flock, and the weakest ones stay with Laban. Jacob grew wealthy doing this. All right? Literary nuances. Let's go through page 50. Served, worked. Notice. Now again, you guys don't, most of us use the NIV, some use King James, some use NRSV, but the translation that I compare with is called the Fox translation. And I think all of you should have a copy of the Fox translation, which is just the first 5 books of the Bible. But what Fox does is he's a Jew that translates the Bible, translates the original Hebrew into into English, but keeping all the literary specialness of it. Keeps the alliteration in it. He keeps the different tools and techniques that the Hebrews use, and which we don't use in the NIV. We just throw them away because the NIV is more worried about whether you understand the passage. They're not worried about whether we keep the poetic beauty of the original Hebrew. So these nuances are kind of passed over in the NIV. Served and worked. Notice throughout this whole narrative that these words are used over and over again. Fox translates as served and service. In contrast to wages. Contrast to wages. For over 14 years, Jacob has served, and now he is requesting service or wages. Even his wives and children belong to Laban as the patriarch of the family, now that Jacob wanted to be the leader of his own flock. So in the ancient Near East, the patriarch owns everything, even your wives. Okay? So Jacob really had nothing. He had been working for Laban. His wives came from Laban. His children came from Laban. Everything was owned by Laban. All of the flocks, he got some wages, but everything literally in ancient Near East was owned by the patriarch. Abraham owned everything until he died, and then Isaac owned everything until he died, and that's why the birthright was so important to Jacob. So Jacob has a birthright, but he really has nothing because Esau is back in Canaan with all the stuff that got passed. Okay, so Laban owns everything, and Jacob is saying, it's time for me to start having my own flock. It's time for me to start owning something. Okay, verse 27, if I have found favor in your eyes, this shows the deferential treatment. Notice, it is Laban who defers to Jacob because he knows the blessing is coming from him. And this is Middle Eastern way to negotiate through compliment. This is normally followed by a request, kind of softening the blow. Okay? Ron, you are just wonderful at what you do. You have the greatest personality I've ever seen, and you know what? You are just the nicest guy I've ever run into. Can I borrow money?
Well, it's about time you recognize the format.
Okay, that's essentially what it is. And that's, even today when I go to the Middle East and go to Egypt, I see that a lot, or I feel that a lot. Everything starts with a compliment. Everything is the most, you are the best, you are the mostest, you are the most wonderful. I think you need to give a tip to this person, right? And that's how they start any kind of negotiation, any kind of request by compliment, which is a nice way to do it, I guess. But all right. Verse 30. When may I? It is almost a bargain to be over polite to the other. This is a Middle Eastern cultural thing even today. They both keep delaying the actual question or actual wages until they both have been overly polite. Don't give me anything, verse 31. Well, yes, he is. You didn't give me anything, I think verse 31 said. He did, but you can see the ploy working itself out. Spotted and speckled or striped is a recessive gene in both sheep and goats. So if you remove them from the herd, there's no chance they will appear again, genetically. So you would think Jacob is relying on his God to grow his flock, but he's actually hatching another deception involving the goats, sheep and goats. Verse 34, 35, Laban and his sons. Notice that Laban doesn't quite trust Jacob, and all the spotted and striped go with Laban's sons, not Jacob's sons. But that leaves Jacob to watch the pure, quote unquote, white and black ones alone, so he can deceive Laban. White. Notice the use of white over and over again. The Hebrew for white is Laban, or the V and the B are pronounced the same in Hebrew. Laban. Laban. So there's a play on Laban's name in there. Pronounced Laban. Poplar, verse 37, is also a play on his name. Labna. It's almost this little switch of the last consonant. Laban Labna. Laban. Laban, Laban, Labna. So you get all these plays on words in the Hebrew here that would be recognized by the Hebrews. peeled branches. Okay, here we're going to talk about this whole thing that he did. Okay, all of this peeling and feeding and watering has two explanations. You need to know that when the animals came to the water troughs to drink, it was most likely when the females were available for breeding. So, first, the ancient Near East had an old wives' tale. You've heard of those, right? Old wives' tales? That what the animal sees while breeding will influence the product of that breeding. So Jacob stripped the bark off branches so they saw striped black and white, encouraging that color of lambs. Okay. Second possibility, there is some sound breeding going on here. You'll notice he targeted the stronger females and probably kept track of the ones with a recessive gene and the males with the same recessive gene to make sure that they got together. Okay, so you have a flock. You can remove all of the spotted and speckled and striped ones out of it, but there's still that recessive gene. If the right two get together, they will have another spotted and speckled one. So Jacob, being the good shepherd he was, he probably knew which ones had it. And those are the ones you get together again the next time. Okay, so and he was watching for the stronger ones at the same time. So he's using all this breeding. Over 10 years, sheep will breed twice a year. Okay, so over 10 years, he's got 20 plus generations that he can work on. So there is some sound genetic in here as well as that old wives' tale to look at. Either way. Okay, we hear a lot about, they believe that certain things will cause certain things, and they may have been that. But there also is some sound genetic engineering here in these sheep. The man grew exceedingly prosperous, verse 43. Was it by God's blessing or by Jacob's deception? A question that runs through the whole Jacob narrative as he struggles with God. So do you think he became wealthy because of his deception, his breeding techniques, or because God blessed him?
He's a scoundrel.
He's a scoundrel. Yeah. A scoundrel that for some reason God is using, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Genesis 31, the journey home. Again, I'm just going to give you the summary here on page 51, instead of reading the whole passage. Laban's sons, Jacob's cousins, are starting to grumble that Jacob is becoming very wealthy off their father, and their attitude toward him was changing. The Lord spoke to him for the first time since Bethel. So how many years? Yeah, probably pretty close to 20. It may have been sometime during the 14 to 20 year time frame, but that things were changing. First time since Bethel, and told him to go back home. So he calls his wives to him and tells him that it is God that made him prosperous and given him the sheep and the goats he has. We find out about another dream where God spoke to him and told him to return to his homeland. The wives agree. They say that Laban has sold them to Jacob, so they will go with him. So they set out to go back to Canaan, but Rachel stole her father's household gods on the way, and they left without telling Laban. Laban finds out 3 days later and caught up with a huge entourage in Gilead. Laban is angry that they snuck off like a thief and not with a party like he would have liked, and he asks why he stole his household gods. Jacob explains and allows Laban to search his camp. Rachel hides the gods by sitting on them. Jacob is now angry and tells the story of Laban's 20 years of abuse and using him. Laban and Jacob make a covenant together and set up stones as a witness. They covenant together for the Lord to keep watch between them. And they parted as family. And that's the summary that we kind of all know. But we got a lot to dig into here. I got 3 pages of literary nuances here for you. 3 pages. All right, first Laban's sons. We saw them in the last chapter just briefly, but they don't play a very big role, do they? Because they watched over the growth of Jacob's flock, and now we see them again in the suspicion of Jacob stealing from their father. Echoes of Esau. but they remain nameless. Okay, the same verbiage in Laban's sons and Esau. Same verbiage that they stole their blessing from their father. Verse 2 is translated as Laban's attitude has changed in modern translations. King James Version, that's supposed to be, King KJV, has beheld the countenance. Literally, it is saw Laban's face, which can be translated a number of ways, because in it is hostility and suspicion. Remember, he's the patriarch, and Jacob is Laban's worker, almost slave, and that has his daughters and grandchildren. Now the attitude has noticeably changed. I will be with you, verse 3. This is the first we know of God speaking to Jacob in 20 years. We learn the whole story as he explains his dream to his wives later in the narrative. But imagine 20 years of silence from God before the promise is renewed. 20 years of silence. I once had a dream, verse 10. This is a difficult passage because we don't know if Jacob is telling the truth to convince his wives that he came about his wealth through a gift of God or the deception of their father. Is he deceiving his wives too? In the dream, he tells his wives that God told him to pick the spotted and striped sheep. Okay? And that it was all God's doing. It doesn't mention anything about the deception and the breeding practices or anything like that. There's a lot of evidence that the Elohist tradition of the God speaking through dreams, whereas the Yahwist, this has not occurred before. Now let me explain the difference between the two. El is not only the generic word for God, it is also the name of a god in the Middle East, in the ancient Near East. Yahweh, obviously, is Jehovah. It's the name God gave Moses on Mount Sinai. That is a particular name of God. So what we see happening, and I'll explain it here again in the nuances, but what we see is Yahweh is absorbing many of the attributes of the ancient Near East gods. What you were worshiping as El now is part of Yahweh. Okay, I believe the best parts of El are part of Yahweh. But there's an Elohist tradition of dreams that was not in the Yahwist tradition. Okay, so pulls that in. Last week we talked about God of the mountains, El Shaddai. Okay, that was also the name of a particular Canaanite god, but God used that name for himself. I am God of the mountains, God Almighty. Okay, so he's incorporating those attributes of other gods. Remember, Yahweh comes from Moses in the burning bush. He's telling the story to the Hebrews, journeying out of Egypt. So picture yourselves as the Hebrews journeying out of Egypt. So all of these names have special meaning. So the nature of Yahweh is absorbing many facets of the regional gods. El Shaddai, God of the mountains, or Almighty, was mentioned in the last dream, and now El is being absorbed by Yahweh. All natures of the one true God. Any share in the inheritance, verse 14. This actually is a merism. The NIV, you can't see it. Okay, who can describe a merism before? The literary technique called merism. Oh, I've done these so many. There's so many of them in the Genesis. What is a merism? Probably the most obvious one in the Bible is Alpha and Omega, beginning and end. It's using the two extremes to explain everything. When Jesus says, I am the Alpha and Omega, he doesn't mean he's just the beginning of the alphabet and the last of the alphabet. He means he is everything in between. Okay, so in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That doesn't mean he just specifically created that and that. It's a merism, meaning he created everything. Everything in between. So here we have a merism as well, any share in the inheritance. The Hebrew is share or inheritance, meaning a little or a lot, covering everything in the middle too. They're saying that they have nothing to do with their father anymore. Finance-wise. Okay, they're saying, hey, he sold us all. We have nothing to do with our father anymore. So do whatever God has told you. Verse 16. First, it shows Jacob's respect for his wives to even ask them to go with him. Second, they were officially property of Laban, and they're willing to break away with Jacob from their father. Verse 19 and 20. Rachel stole, Jacob deceived, and he fled. Does that sound familiar? Here in 2 sentences, we cover Jacob's life MO, his modus operandi. Stole, deceived, fled. Page 53, household gods. This is always a difficult passage, but I think it's included here for a particular reason, and it's a funny reason. Verse 19, the exact etymology of this Hebrew word is not certain, so we don't know exactly what they were. They might have been little figurines, but they also might have been carved plaque-like items. I gave you a picture there on page 52. They could be either one of those. Okay? Either way, they were noticeable, and based on archaeology, they were pretty expensive. Very few homes could afford their own gods. They usually had a central location in the village where they would put their gods on display. They would put their gods on display for the benefit of the whole village or extended family. Again, the patriarch, Laban, would have been responsible for them. Okay, so these household gods were either very expensive or they were very expensive. So they were either in Laban's house, but more likely they were in the center of the village where all of his servants and he and his family were all part of this village. And so here Rachel stole them. They weren't just little things lying around in the house that she picked up. They meant something. Jacob deceived, verse 20, literally took the heart of Laban. A different verb than Jacob's name. Remember, Jacob's name means deceiver or grasper. Okay, is more like fooling, but his name means more a lesser charge. I'm fooling you. Okay, that kind of deception, as opposed to tearing my heart out, deceiving. Where there's much more dramatic verb of taking that which is most precious, the heart. God came to Laban, verse 24. Notice the Elohist version again comes in a dream. Not Yahweh came to Laban, but El came to Laban, insinuating a form of God that Laban was familiar with. Carried off my daughters, verse 26, literally drove my daughters like driving sheep. You drove my daughters away. Why did you deceive me? Verse 27, the verb here is softened. Back to the Jacob insinuation. Why did you Jacob me? Probably in response to God telling him to watch what he says. In that dream that he had, God told him to watch what you're saying to Jacob. Flip to page 54. That person shall not live, says Jacob. Verse 32. Jacob here unknowingly condemns his beloved wife Rachel to death. Words mean things. There's nothing you learn out of Genesis. Words mean things. So he says, anybody who stole those idols will be put to death. It was Rachel. He cannot imagine any in his household stealing, much less his beloved. In less than 2 chapters, she's dead. Sat on them, verse 34. Rachel's actions here would have been hilarious to the listener. Especially her excuse for not getting up because of her period. Things you sit on are unclean, especially things close to a woman who is having her period. The gods are treated in a humorous, do you say "and" in front of an H? In a humorously degrading manner. They would have laughed at that. That Rachel sat on gods and told them she couldn't get up because she was having a period. That was a joke in the ancient Near East. Okay, it's like, seriously, Moses was being funny in this. If it was, I get Moses doing it, but that's still. Okay, that's almost as funny as the Rachel's name meaning the same as the sheep, right? Rachel means you. Here comes you with the U's. Right? Verse 36 and 40 are in poetry form. In your Bibles, you will notice they're in poetry form. And that usually means that they're much older than the rest of the narrative. That's why they put it in poetry form. Okay, in poetry form, and probably part of a story that the rest of the narrative was built around. Okay? One of my theories about how the Bible was put together, especially the first part, was that all these stories were written at some time by Moses, by others, and then it was compiled by a compiler or a redactor. And they would find these old stories and put them in, and then they would build a narrative around them from other stories. Okay, here we have a poem about Jacob and Laban. Okay, but here we have Moses telling the story about Jacob and Laban. So let's put this poem as part of the narrative, right? So you have, that's what redacting is. That's taking all this information and putting it into a form that's understandable so we can read together. So Moses wrote it, I believe, but I believe it was put together later by a redactor or by a compiler, someone who put all those stories of Moses, probably on papyrus since it came out of Egypt, okay? Put all those papyrus together and put them into a narrative that we can understand to build the identity for the Hebrews, the Israelites at that time. So this is one of those examples of an older story being incorporated into the narrative. So they put it in poetic form here. All right. All you see is mine, verse 43. Laban is feeling the guilt of his deceiving Jacob so many times and abusing their relationship. Plus he's in fear of God that Jacob invokes, the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac. So Laban uses his only recourse as a patriarch to level the playing field. All you see is mine, according to the law. Yegar, Sahadutha, and Gilead, verse 43, literally witness heap of stones. Witness heap of stones. It's different languages to say the same thing. And then Mizpah is also, verse 49, literally a keep watch. It seems that they have taken a heap of that heap of stones and built them into a tower or a pillar of some kind. Shepherds would, from then on, build these towers or pillars to keep watch over their flocks. The God of Abraham, God of Nahor, God of their father. Verse 53, probably not invoking Yahweh, but El, the best Laban could do. He invokes the gods in a binding oath, basically setting a boundary between nations. He is eliminating the family line and connections and stopping all further mixing of the two nations. No more wives from Paddan Aram. He set the boundary. He said, no more. You guys aren't allowed to come across here anymore to find your wives, like Rebecca, like Rachel and Leah. Okay? He's setting so we think it's kind of a friendly boundary, but it was a very legalistic contract between nations. Don't cross this boundary again without permission. You're not family, we're just bordering nations now. And then the fear of Isaac, it describes God as the fear of Isaac, verse 53. This is literally dread or awe, but Jacob does not personalize this to himself, but to his father. It's not the fear of Jacob, it's the fear of Isaac. It's not Isaac he fears, but what Isaac feared, he feared. And the thing that Isaac feared, he feared. A lot of stuff in these two chapters. We went over it pretty quickly. Any questions before we talk about Mizpah a little more in depth? Any more questions? Okay, I'm sure you'll come up with them later. Mizpah and Migdal Eder on page 55. Genesis 31, we have a tower built to watch over Laban and Jacob as a promise to keep the peace between the nations. It's called the Mizpah. But then in Genesis 35, the same type of thing, Mizpah tower, is built to watch over Rachel as she dies giving birth to Benjamin just outside the city of Ephrathah, Bethlehem. Starting to see a little bit of a connection here, right? Micah 4, verse 8 and 9. As for you, watchtower of the flock, stronghold of daughter Zion, the former dominion will be restored to you. Kingship will come to daughter Jerusalem. Why do you now cry aloud? Have you no king? Has your ruler perished? The pain that seized you is like a woman in labor. Rachel dies giving birth. Okay? And this Micah is using this analogy, this watchtower, this Mizpah, and connecting it with the pains of labor, producing what? A new king? Possibly? A new king? Micah 5 verse 2, he explains it. But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who is to be watch over Israel. It's translated as ruler, but it's Mizpah. One who is to be Mizpah over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times, which comes straight out of Luke. Well, Matthew quotes that, but so does Luke. So Joseph, Luke 2, so Joseph went to Bethlehem. When they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him in clothes and placed him in a manger, because there was no guest room available for them. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find the baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. Where were their mangers?
In houses,
In stables.
in houses too sometimes, or next to the barn, their barn and stuff.
Sometimes they would keep them. How many of you remember Frankie's sermon on Migdal Eder,
We were like
the watchtower?
special.
Yeah, it's a watchtower. It's a Mizpah. The Aramaic is Migdal Eder. Jesus was more likely born in a Migdal Eder than he was in this little shack we think out behind a hotel. Okay, they really didn't have those. Okay, they brought the animals someplace else. So a Migdal Eder is this tower out where the shepherds were keeping watch. The Mizpah, this stone tower that's built that way, goes all the way back to what we were talking about in Genesis, that stone tower. It's more likely that Jesus was born in a Mizpah than in this picture we have out back behind a hotel that all creches, that all nativity scenes have. Okay, it's more likely it's in one of those towers, because that's where the mangers were. Now you're right, they had them in homes and they would feed, but in order to have a manger, that insinuates this box, right? That you put the food in, and that you're not going to waste your money on building the box, you just throw the food on the ground for your animals, unless it's your job. Then you spend the money on building a manger, on a box to hold food for the animals, because they're there all the time. And they especially kept the herding sheep, or the ones that were picked on by the flock, the ones that were having troubles, the runt of the litter, were brought into the Migdal Eder, the Mizpah.
Is that what that?
Yeah. I got some number of different pictures of them in there, because we still find those Migdal Eders around. Turn to page, I guess you have to back up. There it is, on page 51 is what's left of one that was built. That's more likely what Jesus was born in than the scene we have based on our nativity sets. So there's a definite connection here. And it's just interesting, of course, it was in Bethlehem, outside of Jerusalem, where all of this happened. All right, conclusion, page 56. Why did Jacob have to leave Laban?
God told him.
God told him. Okay, that's always the best reason. What's another reason?
To get out of the servanthood or slavery.
Yeah, he might get on his own.
Yeah, he had to get on his own, because everything was Laban's. over here. He had to break away from that. He had to break away from that so it would be his. And God could prove that he was blessing Jacob and not blessing Laban because of Jacob. He was blessing Jacob and his family. What did the Israelites hear? Remember, you're the Israelites, or the Hebrews that just left Egypt. You're wandering in the desert for 40 years, and Moses is telling these stories and recounting these stories and getting them written down for you. And what did you hear about why Laban, or why Jacob had to leave Laban, and why he had to get up?
To go back to Isaac the land.
To go back to the land.
I mean, not Isaac.
So who's who in this metaphor?
Isaac. Oh, Jacob's them.
Jacob is them. You Hebrews out in the desert. Okay. Laban is Egypt. Okay. They get all the spoils, the blessings from Egypt, right? When they left, they got all the stuff, the good stuff from Egypt as they were leaving. Just like Jacob got all the good stuff leaving from Laban. And he has to tear himself away because there's this codependency between Laban and Jacob. And the same thing between Egypt and Israel. God had to tear them apart. He could not bless Israel in the land of Egypt. He could, but he wants to separate that blessing. Just like he did the same with Jacob and Laban. He had to pull them apart, separate them. So this is God blessing you, Israel, on your way back to the promised land. Okay? This is you. You are Jacob. You are Israel, which is coming next week. The name change. So that's what they're hearing. This is a parallel to them. Leaving Egypt, heading back. What can we draw from this narrative? What lessons do we get from this narrative? Why was it put in the Bible? We have the same struggle, the same kind of struggle Jacob is having, right? All of that's in us. Do we try to do it on our own and maybe even push God into blessing? Or do we wait for God to bless us? How much do we do versus how much does God do? That whole battle. You know what I'm talking about? How do you feel that battle? How much do you do to get the blessing from God versus how much do you have to sit back and allow God to do what he needs to do? That's one of our biggest struggles, I think, in life. How much work do you do to get God to bless you? Or do you sit back and allow God to bless you? That's that whole battle that you fight within your heart and your mind. Okay, now, do we, for me as a pastor of a church, do I got to go out every day and do I got to meet new people every day and push you people to meet new people every day to bring them in the church and to do all this, and will only then God bless us? Or do we wait for God to send the people?
Things need to be balanced.
But you know the struggle.
Oh yeah.
It's not just in that. There are jobs that we can take or not take. Okay. Okay. Now this one might require me working on Sunday, or maybe doing something a little more shady, or being away from my family a little bit more, but it's worth more money. Now, do I take that, even though I won't be able to spend as much time with my family, I won't be able to spend as much time with my church, I won't be able to spend as much time doing the things I need to do, but it's more money? It's that whole balance. Battle. And that's what Jacob, I think, is fighting. That's why he watched over the flock, but he also kind of, do you understand what I mean by pushed God's blessing? He really wanted to push, do a little bit faster, God. 20 years there, he waited for the blessing.
He used deception too, didn't he?
Yeah, yeah, and I find that's what we end up doing a lot. We kind of play on the edges instead of doing the true obedience. But it's a as Bill said, it's a balance. Where is it?
And if we accept
Pray, but
that,
keep your powder dry.
yeah, if we accept that God's will, I mean, this is the story of it's God's story, so it would have happened anyway. But God was able to use
Right,
his
right.
deceptions.
Can you see the difficulty? It's a battle that he brings out here thousands and thousands of years ago, but also it's something we.
What did Paul say,
all
oh
the time.
wretched man that I am?
Let's say that again.
Paul said, oh wretched man that I
Yeah,
am.
yeah. Why do I keep doing that?
We want to help God out.
Yeah, we do. We do. That's one of the things I use for people who haven't hit bottom yet. We need to get out of the way of God. And we think, oh, we need to help them out, we need to do this, we can, set them up in a new place, we need to give them some money, and then it's gone again, and we say, we need to help them out, we need to give them How many times do you do that before you figure out you're getting in God's way with what He's trying to do in that person's life? Right? And that's us. We keep trying to do it on our own, but there's a balance there. We do need to do stuff on our own. We do need to. Okay?
It's just like we have to go out and plant the seed,
Right.
and God takes care of it. We have to do what we have to do, what He tells us to do, and then the rest is up to Him.
There's a story about flooding. There was some flooding that happened. I may have used this already in church or whatever. That's when you guys had me for over 16 years. My stories start repeating. The flood happens and people have to escape. They're up on the roof of their house, and a guy goes by in a boat. And he says, hop on the boat, I'll rescue you. And the people on the roof say, no, we've been praying, God's going to save us. A second time a boat goes by and hey, hop on. And now the water's up onto the roof, and it's coming close to it. And a boat goes by and they say, hey, hop on, we'll rescue you. And they say, no, we've been praying, God's going to bless us, God's going to rescue us. This time the water's all the way, it's up to their waist. They're standing on the roof and the water's up to the waist. The boat comes by, hurry up, get on, And they say, no, we've been praying. God's going to bless us. God's going to rescue us. And of course they drowned. And they come before God and they say, God, what are you doing? I mean, we know you were going to save us. You were going to rescue us. And God says, I sent you 3 boats. Right? Where's the balance between what we need to do versus what we allow God to do? Sheep and goats are kind of difficult for non-farmers. So a little bit of training on what sheep and goats are. I have been to the Middle East, in Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey, and Israel, and I've grown up on a farm, but I was not a sheep or a goat farmer, it should be. Yet I have seen many sheep and goats, and the truth is, it's hard to tell them apart. At least the ones I've seen. So our tour guide and locals just call them sheep goats. You see a flock, I don't know, Judy, when you were in the Middle East, did you see a flock or a herd of sheep goats? It's really hard to tell which are sheep and which are goats as this flock, this herd goes across them. They're not.
Interesting.
And they're usually not well fed, so they're not, in Australia you see these huge sheep that have these huge coats on them and stuff. Well, that's not the Middle East sheep goats. You can't really tell that much of a difference between them. In fact, look at I'll let you skip over to page 49. Look at the pictures there on 49. Tell me which one is a sheep and which one's a goat. Sheep goats. Okay. Sheep were generally the most delicate and usually with white coats. They love and stayed in the valley and plains and were or are never good in rocky crags or mountainous areas. They feed on grass more than leaves and shrubs and don't eat in the heat of the day. They tend to lay down and rest in the shade. They were used for wool, and the first fleece was given to the priest, and difficult to control and more likely to get in trouble. Goats were used for milk, for meat, and their coats made great leather. So goats are the opposite. Their coats made great leather. And I think the fact that sheep produce wool is the whole reason why their skins are not that prized, whereas other animals don't produce that kind of thing on their skin. So. Feeding the flock was the most difficult part of shepherding, both sheep and goats. In the spring, the food was plentiful and abundant, and that's why harvesting usually occurred at the end of summer or the beginning of fall, while the animals were at their fattest. The fall and winter were difficult times, and the shepherd had to lead their flock not only far away to find food, but away from competitor flocks. Separating the sheep from goats was a regular occurrence for feeding, since they preferred different vegetation. The flock moved toward the shepherd, and he would tap them with his rod on one side to go one way, and on the other side to go the other. So he would separate the sheep and the goats, just as Jesus mentioned in Matthew. That was a regular thing, and everybody knew separating. You would just tap it on the side of the head, and the sheep would go this way, tap the goat on that side, and they'd go that way, up on the mountainside to feed, and the sheep down in the valley to feed. Okay? So, now that you know that, hopefully this will make a little bit more sense to you as we go through the sheep and the goats as wages. Page 49, Genesis 30, verse 25 to 43. If you All right, so today we're talking about Jacob heading back home again after his trip out to Paddan Aram to be with his uncle Laban. And how many years? Anybody know offhand? How many years did he actually spend in Paddan Aram?
14.
14? 20.
I just read it this morning.
It's part of what you're supposed to read, so all of you should have known that, except for the new guests here, because they didn't get the assignment last week. So, but yeah, how did he increase his flocks? Anybody remember? How did his flocks get increased while he was there with Laban? How did he get flocks in the beginning, in the first place? How did he get sheep to begin with?
He was a sly old guy.
Yeah. So what did he do?
Deceived Esau.
What's that?
You got
Deceived
compared-
Esau. That was earlier for the birthright and the blessing, but now how did he deceive, or how did he get the flocks from Laban?
He swapped some black for white, or white for black,
Yeah.
one or the other.
Yeah, this whole thing about striped and spotted sheep to separate out and all of that, we're going to talk about that today. What is all that stuff about? What did Laban do? And why? Priests and Levites as a type. The tail of the sheep is unusual because it is similar to a camel hump, in that it is a collection of fatty tissue for storage of energy and not cartilage. Therefore was a prized possession in Bible times. Also it was requested by God in sacrificing. Take from this ram the fat tail, put these in the hands of Aaron and his sons as a burnt offering pleasing to the Lord. Exodus 29. Sheep were used for their wool. Wool was the primary clothing of the day. Okay? Rarely for food, and only on special occasion. The skin was not good, still is not good, for leather. So often they wore sheepskin that still had the wool on it, a fleece. Okay? So you don't see much sheep leather because the skin is just not good for leather. All right? And again, primary clothing of the day was wool, and it's itchy. If you ever wear wool just on your skin, it's pretty itchy. If you were wealthy, then you would get into more of the linens and stuff like that. But man, wool was the primary for just about everybody. Goats. Goats were generally more sturdy and usually with black coats. They loved the slopes and the mountainside where they can find the leaves and the shrubs they like the most. Goats feed during the day, no matter the heat. The goats are much more headstrong. When he found out he was all the sheep and
As
stuff.
soon as he made the agreement with Jacob, he got rid of all of them and took them way far away from
Yeah,
them.
yeah. He sent them away 3 days' journey to make sure that the flocks did not intermingle. And it's interesting because Laban sent his sons over with Jacob's flock, and he had Jacob take care of his own flock. So he knew the blessing was there with wherever Jacob was. And so he kept Jacob with his own flock. But turns out that didn't work out too well for him. What is Mizpah? Any of you went way back when you were dating and your sweetheart and you gave each other Mizpah stones or Mizpah necklace or anything like that? Nobody ever had one of those? Well, Frankie and I did. Little hits.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I'm interrupting.
It's a
your
watch,
story.
no. It means to watch over, right? To watch over. And we're going to go over that because that is a very significant phrase, not only in Genesis, but through the whole Bible. So we're going to end with that today. All right, now you may flip the page. Roland, you're not supposed to be looking ahead. No,
Okay.
because you're a rookie, I'll let you get away with it. All right, page 48. Sheep and goats. Most people are not farmers anymore. So all these references to sheep